Luisa and Elie Wiesel founded Forum 2000 for a purpose.
We have to use the past to not becoming our children's future.
Thank you very much. I am honored to be here, and I want to thank President Havel for convening another extraordinary gathering of Forum 2000.
So those people, please think more seriously, and we should develop new ideas, and then important is implementation.
Dámy a pánové, vážení přítomní, já vás co nejsrdečněji vítám na konferenci Forum 2000.
The world is upside down. How should we put it back together? Are we able to act responsibly? Can we work together, play by the rules, and restore solidarity? Let's use this crisis as an opportunity. A new world emerging? Watch the online Forum 2000 conference, October 12th to 14th.
Oh, now I can see my co-discussants. Online? Should we start? So, finally we made it. After some technical difficulties, this kind of international conference connecting people from all over the globe digitally is, of course, an experiment. But now we can start with our evening-long panel on climate change after COVID, which may be a little bit over-optimistic because we will have to deal with COVID-19 for the foreseeable future. So we have to deal with a double challenge, climate change and COVID-19 at the same time. I guess the common point of departure of our evening discussion is that there's no doubt that climate change is the most pressing challenge for the decades to come, with a deep impact on human security, on economic prosperity, on global health, and even on the future of our young democracies. And at the same time, it's clear that we are significantly behind schedule if we want to limit global warming to 1.5 or maximum than 2%, preventing it from crossing thresholds when global warming will spiral out of control and become non-manageable. So I'm very glad to have three speakers tonight, which are all heavily and deeply engaged in climate change and climate policy. I will start with Arunabha Ghosh. He's the founder and the chief executive officer of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, one of the leading climate think tanks globally. And he's affiliated to very much institutions and activities, governmental-wise, civil society, and in science to fight climate change. Welcome, Arunabha.
Thank you.
The next one, Luisa Neubauer. All of those who are a little bit familiar with Germany know her. She's one of, I would say, the most visible and popular activist of Fridays for Future in Germany. member of the Foundation for the Rights of the Future Generations, 350-degree org, the Right Livelihood Award Foundation, the Fossil Free Campaign, and a lot of other activities. Welcome, Luisa. And finally, Bedřich Moldan. He is the founder and director of the Charles University Environment Center and a member of the Forum 2000 Foundation Program Council. He played a crucial role in the introduction of environmental legislation after 1989 in Czechia and served as the first Czech Minister of Environment, and since then in many national and international public policy positions. So welcome, Bedřich. Without further ado, because we are a little bit late, I would like to start with an opening question to all of you. What is the impact of the corona crisis on the fight against climate change? Has it changed public political priorities? Will COVID-19 slow down efforts to stop global warming, or can we turn it into an opportunity to speed up the ecological transition of our economies, maybe with a look to the European Union and the European Green Deal program, which is not just a traditional economical recovery program, but at least has the aspiration to use this crisis as an opportunity to go forward in greening our economies. So I would like to start again with Arunabha. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ralf, and good evening to everyone. It's late in the evening here in India, and good day to those listening in from other parts of the world. And many thanks to Forum 2000 for inviting me to speak on this important issue. The short answer is that the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in two kinds of responses with regards to the fight against climate change. The first is a realization that tail-end risks are not something that we can ignore. The second is an excuse that the fight against climate change can be postponed. Now, these are two sort of centrifugal forces that are going to compete against each other. Why? What is a tail-end risk? These are risks that have, on paper, low probability, but when they come true, they have devastating impact. The pandemic is one such example. No one expected it to happen at this scale, but when it did, it shut down the whole world. Climate risks are non-linear, which means that as we progress through time, those risks are actually going to increase. So what is the tail risk today becomes the normal in the future. But what the pandemic does, it makes us understand or makes us realize that should such climate risks unfold, whether it's a coastal flooding event, a once-in-a-century event, or once-in-3 centuries event beginning to happen much more frequently, or whether it's severe drought, or whether it's loss in agricultural produce. These are things that we can no longer ignore because they have not just an environmental impact, but can significantly disrupt at least the way we think we want to lead our lives. However, on the other side, there is, of course, the urgency of having to recover the economies from the depths that they have fallen. And that's a problem for the developed world, for the developing world, and for emerging economies in between. And that is why some governments are perhaps not taking the crisis as seriously now, thinking that their first priority is to try and get the economies back on an economic growth trajectory. So these different forces will only come together when we realize that there is only one way out of this. And that one way is that we deliver on three things simultaneously: jobs, growth, and sustainability. And often when we evaluate public policy, and I've been looking at not just India, but emerging Asia, North America, Europe, we often begin to see that these three priorities tend to present before us a so-called impossible trinity. That we can achieve two, but not all three. And that's the notion that we have to negate with evidence and with action. If we did that, then the fight against climate change actually gets a boost as a result of the pandemic, because we realize we can deliver on sustainability even if we are trying to fulfill on jobs and growth. I can get the details later, but let me stop here for now.
Thank you very much, Arunabha. I would like to pass to Luisa Neubauer, I guess with a critical assessment on the state of European politics. But first, I would like to ask you if you would agree to this kind of trinity Arunabha just was mentioning, this trias of jobs, growth, and sustainability that we have to combine and to deal with simultaneously in parallel.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for the kind introduction. So the essence, what I just took away from what Arunabha just pointed out so eloquently, is that the corona crisis has the potential, at least, to distract us and to provide welcomed excuses. And the other important thing, I think, here is that we are indeed, though, capable on tackling several crises at the same time if we decided that we want to. That is what the corona crisis did. It showed, and it still shows, if we are willing to, if we really want, we can take a crisis seriously. And in terms of the climate crisis, that was in doubt for a long time, obviously. So I think that is something that we can surely take away from the corona crisis when we combine. Let me just elaborate on that for one sentence. If we come back to your main question on the interconnectedness between corona and the climate, I think one aspect that is often overlooked is the question of where does the drive, the forces, the push for climate action comes from. And that is not governments alone. It is not even mostly government, but it is or has been in the last couple of years civil society that has been pushing for climate action, that has been, driving a discourse, and that has made possible that such developments, like in the last 2 years, as we saw all over the world in the terms of climate, were possible. If there's now a corona crisis that is kind of occupying lots of people's lives, that is kind of threatening people in a different way, it also absorbs in a very dangerous way civil society's potential to push for climate action on the governmental side. So governments will do eventually, or at least democratic governments tend to do, at least what many people ask for, or what they think they might be asking for, or what they might want. Yet if public spaces and political spaces shut down, if it's not possible to protest on the streets, it is shutting up and for at least pausing an incredibly important source of non-governmental political power that comes from the street, that comes from the people. That is what I'm most worried about when it comes to the corona pandemic and its impact on the climate. Coming back to your questions, Ralf, I think looking at the climate, we need to understand that the climate is less a problem or an issue or one thing that we need to solve next to many others, but the basic assumption that the world is changing in catastrophic ways. We are seeing now a 1.2 degree warmer world, and it is on fire. At least parts of it, and other parts are melting, and we're seeing livelihoods being degraded every single day. And that is not, you can't overlook that. So I think understanding the climate more as a fundamental assessment on which we need to, build up other political ideas and goals, is a more fruitful attempt to understand this. Organizing society for the future within the climate crisis and within our attempts to solve it is surely right. And that has to do with jobs as well as growth. However, on the growth aspect, I would argue on what kind of growth we're talking about, because obviously there's no law that says that people can only be happy if you keep on digging for resources. So it's quite the opposite. But of course, an increase in education, and you can call that growth, of course, an increase in happiness and infrastructure, of course, and access to basic human rights and job guarantees. All those things, of course, are part of that better future that we are fighting for, which by the end of the day just depends on if we are able to solve the climate crisis quickly and just enough.
Thanks a lot, Luisa. Maybe we come back to the growth issue a little bit later. I guess the perspective on economic growth differs fundamentally if you're living in Germany or in India or in Africa, or maybe even in Czechia, Bedřich. What are the priorities in Central Eastern Europe now, and how do you see the link between COVID-19 and climate change?
Okay, thank you. Let me say something from a little different perspective. If we look at the two enormous crises, that is COVID crisis and climate change crisis, they have something in common. And this is just one thing, and it is that both are very global. And I think that we all are realizing that this is both are global issues, but unlike the climate issue, the governments mostly regard and deal with the COVID crisis as they would be a national crisis. And this is, in fact, very bad. And we should look at various aspects of that. First of all, certainly closing the borders. And finally, if we are looking at the development of the possible cure and all the things which are being prepared from the pharmaceutical industry, we should be very much aware that this should and must not be a national priority, that they must be also taken globally. What I feel is that people in the growing sentiment among people is that this nationalistic attitude is very bad indeed in principle and generally, and especially certainly in a connection, in context with the climate crisis. And so what I would like to stress is two recommendations. One is for the governments, stay away from the nationalistic principle and be more oriented towards global cooperation. And the second is also the same message for the non-governmental sector, because I see sometimes even the non-governmental organizations and other non-governmental entities a certain tendency to confine ourselves into the national international framework. And I think that this is really a way to help. And I am a little afraid that the same applies also to the European Union as a whole. And therefore, I very much appreciate if the European Commission and European Parliament and certainly the whole European Union is stressing the role of global public goods, because the management of the of the climate crisis must be seen as a real global public good, and we should, all of us, try to help and to contribute to this, to the creation of this global public good. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bedřich. I would like to dig a little bit deeper in this comparison you made between the nature of COVID-19 and the nature of climate change. Obviously, both are global phenomena and need enhanced international cooperation and then common action. While we observed during the corona crisis that we had the reverse effect, as you mentioned, closing borders and looking for national solutions, national answers to limit at least the spread of COVID-19. Maybe slowly we are now in a learning process that we need this kind of international cooperation in research and development, but also kind of solidarity to assist poorer countries in their health care systems. But I would like to point to another aspect of the corona experience. If you're looking to the reaction of most governments, at least in the West, it was about restriction. To restrict mobility, to restrict public activities, to restrict social life, and of course to restrict to a certain extent economic activities. We saw a decline of global trade, of global exchange, disruption of global value chains during the COVID-19 because of this nationalization of our policies. And yet, although we had a dramatic economic decline, especially in the developing world and also in some European countries, up to 15% reduction of GDP, the reduction of global CO2 emissions at the highest point of the shutdown in April was only around about 17%. So what would you say? Is this the way to deal with climate change, by restrictions, by limiting social and economic activities? Is this the way we should deal with climate change, or do we have to look for another response? Who would like to start? Maybe again, Arunabha.
Well, thank you. Again, the short answer is no. Not just because restrictions are hard to sustain over a very long period of time, but as you just said, Ralf, that even if we did shut down the entire planet, we still did not manage to, on average, get, the estimation was that through the course of 2020, we would have maybe a 5 to 7% reduction in emissions globally, in the best case scenario. Yeah. And that's still falling short of what the UNEP emissions gap report suggests of more than 7.5% of emissions reduction year on year. Mm-hmm. So clearly, what, again, the pandemic has done is it's, despite the unfortunate public health and humanitarian crisis, it's actually played out for us a social experiment at scale that demonstrates that this way will not work, that we keep emitting till one day we decide to not emit is not going to work. And if you look at a number of scenarios that look at overshoots in emissions, on the assumption that in a year, say after 2035 or 2040 or 2050, we can pull the curve down and get into negative emissions territory and all will be well. The pandemic is telling us that approach is a foolhardy approach. So what is the alternative? The alternative is that we have to, number one, reassess how we value growth. Unless we put in a value to the natural capital of using the natural capital and preserving the natural capital and monetize it, we will not be able to redefine that highly crude metric which we call GDP. Once we begin to revalue growth, we have to revalue what we mean by inclusive growth. And that is where distribution of the way the economic opportunities are created for the poor, for migrant labor, for people affected by climate and environmental catastrophes, etc., we have to again place a premium on creating opportunity for such vulnerable communities. When we bring those two different revaluations together of growth and of inclusive growth, then we see that all the things that looked expensive, that looked not possible in terms of sustainability, suddenly actually begins to look like the most obvious thing to do. Not because you are a tree hugger, so to speak, but because from a mainstream economics perspective, you begin to put capital towards where you get the best return. And you get the best return on the assets that you value the most. So that really has to be the way forward. Shutting down the planet cannot be. The pandemic has proven to us that that's not going to succeed.
So, Luisa, would you like to comment on these remarks? And in addition to that, I would like to invite you. I think this is quite of interest for our audience to comment on the European Green Deal. Is this an example for the world? Is this the way forward, or where do you see the shortcomings?
Yes. So, firstly, on the aspect of how do we approach growth and how do we value our living environment, I think that is a very good point, a very important one as well, that you just made. What we are, like the way rich nations around the world, and I'm in particular talking here about Germany right now, where we're living is not something we could technically afford. And it is also something that only works out because we're ignoring the tremendous cost, both in damages and both on human suffering, that this lifestyle is producing. This is not something that can work out in the long run, and everything would change at the point that we would, stop valuing this lifestyle, that economic system, that economic approach on growth, on GDP, but on, for instance, well-being, on sustainability, etc. Quickly touching up on your question, Ralf, on the question of how do we deal with Corona and the crisis, we need to understand that obviously the Corona pandemic is an inherently different crisis to the climate crisis. These are two very different issues. Some things overlap and some things we can learn from one crisis for another. Yet eventually we're talking of a decade-long transformation, a deep transformation in the industrial revolution style when we talk on the climate crisis. On Corona, we're talking short-term, we're talking of a health crisis and something that can be solved eventually with a vaccine. And there's no vaccine for the climate. So this is, I think something that is that kind of, answer that question to that point. Obviously, we cannot take the Corona crisis as an example of how do we deal with the climate crisis. But when it comes to lockdowns, when it comes to restrictions, I think a very, very important lesson that we have learned here across the world even is what happens if we don't prevent if we don't invest in prevention, crisis prevention, and for the climate crisis, we are very well aware what this means. It means drastic emission reductions now. Things will get tough, and eventually they will get less. We will lose freedom. We will lose the time to make shared decisions.
We'll slip into kind of emergency government. Yeah.
Sorry?
We will slip into a kind of emergency regime. Yeah.
Yes, and I think that is something that we need to. So if we're looking for free democracies and we want to strengthen them, we prevent crises and we invest in resilience. And that means, in terms of the climate crisis, as just mentioned, it means an emission reduction every single year for a long time. And that is a tough transition that's before us. Yet, we can imagine what the alternative is. And I don't think that is favorable for anyone. When it comes to solutions, of course, the Green Deal is talking of the European Green Deal. We need to understand that a Green Deal has kind of on the ambition side. So looking at where we are now in terms of the climate crisis, we simply don't have time, nor should we, start with solutions that aren't, or I don't see a point in, celebrating solutions that aren't in line with the Paris Agreement. And the Green Deal is maybe a framework that can be filled with, solutions that are coherent enough and radical enough to get along the lines of the Paris Agreement. And I mean, the American alternative is sort of trying to get there. But for that, I believe the Green Deal is, from my perspective, a framework that can be very, very hopeful at that point as it starts treating the climate crisis as the kind of crisis it is, and very much delivers on the emission reduction side.
So thanks. Bedřich, what is the European Green Deal about? It's about huge investments, public and private in investments in popping up in accelerating the energy revolution, phasing out fossil fuels, moving to alternative energies. It's about electric mobility. It's about the reconstruction of our cities, making them climate neutral. It is even about finding sustainable solutions for the heavy industries like the chemical industry or the cement industry. So this is, I would say, a kind of framework, as Luisa said it, for a kind of a green industrial revolution. What does it mean from your perspective? Do you think Europe can become a pioneer in this transition of our industrial society?
I hope very much that Europe can be a sort of pioneer, and that if we look at the world situation today, there certainly the pioneers are lacking. And if you look, for instance, to the role which unfortunately plays the US in these days, who else than Europe? It couldn't. I hope very much that Europe could be in position to not to only dwell on the frameworks and big ideas, but will be able to elaborate fully the details of the Green Deal. I think the Green Deal is a great idea. I would even say this is the only the only way how to get out of the climate crisis. I definitely don't think the shutdown of the whole economy or whatever else similar could be the solution. There must be the way forward, but I am not quite sure. Two things to that. One is really we would definitely stress that the Europe must work very hard on the details, because as always the devil is in the details. And second, there must be all kind of provisions and rules and all the measures which should be applied. I have in mind from my own experience in the past, a very important issue is indicators. We have a rather not very good indicators for the economic growth. Was already mentioned. GDPs is not really the only one, and not perhaps the most good one. So we should look at these indicators and be that there they could play a very important role in mobilizing the public awareness and the pushing, so to say, the public sentiment into the right course. Let me just even one aspect which I started with, and this is the aspect of the global difference between COVID and climate crisis. If you look at the economic aspect of both, then and I am not talking about the impacts of the COVID, the impact of the shutting down the whole economies in whole countries, but how to go forward. And one thing is to help in the not only development but also the use of the preventive and curing devices like different pharmaceuticals. And we should look at the fact that if the prevention by means of some sort of vaccine could be effective, there should be the distribution among millions and millions, billions actually people, and this means also the financial and economic burden, and we should look at that as a big challenge, which is which stands in front of the global community, and it could be a sort of guidance also for how to deal with the climate crisis. There also should be a global solidarity, starting with European Union, the US, and other rich countries, starting perhaps with the Green Deal for Europe, and not forgetting that it is also a sort of responsibility, and responsibility not only in the terms of some rhetoric, but economic responsibility for the rest of the world.
Thanks a lot, Arunabha. I remember the history of global climate negotiations, and I guess you are very aware of that all the time from the beginning there was this kind of rhetorics, or say principle of differentiated obligations, responsibilities and burdens between the global south and the highly industrialized, the old industrialized world in the global north. Is this still playing an important role in the Indian discourse on climate change and international climate policy? And what are your expectations, if you have any, towards Europe?
Well, I'll answer both those questions. Number one, the Paris Agreement made it very clear that even with differentiated responsibilities, it did not absolve any country, big or small, from taking action. And that was the fundamental change that came about as a result of the architecture of climate negotiations undergoing that transformation in 2015, or it was a culmination of several years of efforts. And India, along with other countries, came forward with a plan. Now, in this time, actually, India is on track, and it's one of the only few major economies that is actually whose climate plan is on track for a 2-degree world. That does not mean India should not do more. During the course of the pandemic, since we went into lockdown in March, India has tendered out more than 12,000 megawatts of renewables. I had advised the Prime Minister's office way back in 2014 about how big India could get on renewables. I wrote the first concept note of the International Solar Alliance, which now has more than 80 member countries. So India can, despite its differentiated responsibilities, lead the world as one of many climate leaders. However, what Paris also demonstrates is that it is not sufficient for individual countries to take individual action, which is where you need to find ways to work together. So in fact, my organization, the EW, is the technical partner for the EU-India Climate and Clean Energy Partnership, where I believe a few key areas of cooperation are necessary. Number one, as one of the other speakers, I think Bedřich was mentioning, is finance. In 2018, 40% of the world's energy investment went to 15% of the world's population in the rich countries. And 15% of the world's energy investment went to more than 40% of the world's population in the emerging economies. Now, if the sun shines the most in the tropics, why isn't capital flowing? We've got a target of 175,000 megawatts of renewables. We've raised that target of 450,000 megawatts of renewables by 2030. Where's the capital? I'm not even talking about grants. I'm talking about real capital. Right? Mm-hmm. So something fundamentally has to change in the way we assess risk and how institutional investors, the pension funds in Germany and the institutional investors and the insurers in London, why are they not putting money where the projects are in emerging economies? The other aspect, and I'm going to stop there, is on the, and I think again, Bedřich was mentioned, we have to do a major multi-country collaboration, technological collaboration on the hard-to-abate sectors, iron and steel, cement, fertilizer, petrochemicals, and the base foundational technology for that could be green hydrogen. Now, I know the EU has a plan for clean hydrogen, but I'm pushing it forward, not clean hydrogen out of natural gas, but green hydrogen out of renewables. And no country has individually cracked this nut. Even though Sweden has a test project, Japan has a test project, multiple countries coming together, pooling their resources to create this foundational technology. What Luisa was saying, the new form of industrial revolution with this foundational technology could transform the really hard-to-abate sectors, even while we electrify, even while we green the electricity sector, there's the rest of the energy sector to be solved. So get the institutional cap going where the sun shines the most and get a real effective technological collaboration going.
I like this argument very much because I think it hits at the nerve of the German and European discussion on greening our energy sector and our industries, kind of solar hydrogen, an economy which clearly needs transnational cooperation in big scale. Not only within Europe, but also beyond Europe, with North Africa, with the Middle East, and other continents. We are running out of time, unfortunately, so I would like to give Luisa and Bedřich the opportunity for a final, very short remark. 1 minute, please, each. Luisa.
Do you have a particular question or specific question?
Maybe you would like to enter this comment on the kind of international cooperation we need.
Well, yes, of course. I mean, that's we are still in a tragedy of the commons, and still a tragedy the way things are going, physically spoken. Yet, what do we need to do to free ourselves from the pathway of that tragedy and turn this into something which I would call like a rom-com or so? And that only works if we turn towards each other without fighting each other, but in solidarity. And this starts with acknowledging the issue that is, a different sort of burden, and whose damages and sufferings are, very disproportionately globally. By acknowledging the need to act, even though if you're not affected personally, but if you're, in the first instance at least, acting for the greater good of someone else, I think that's a first step towards that new sense of global solidarity that we surely need. And the next steps is really how do we, build pathways out of this crisis and walk them together, even if we're coming from highly different backgrounds. Okay. And for that, surely, I think the greatest argument, I will give it to Bertrand.
Thank you very much. Bedřich.
Thank you. I will be very brief. I think that both the COVID and especially the climate crisis should be seen as an enormous challenge and, in fact, burden of responsibility for the rich countries and especially for Europe. And I would stress just one thing, and it is not only on the governments, because we have democratic governments and they are basically following the wishes and the attitudes and interests of the people. So it depends on all of us, on the people in general, on the audience at large, and so if we would express our responsibilities in various ways, I think that is the only way how to get out of both these crises.
Thank you very much to all three of you. It was very short time for a very big topic. I would just like to finish with the remark that fighting COVID-19 as well as fighting climate change is also part of the new systemic competition we are in between liberal democracies and authoritarian regimes. And we will have to do everything we are able to prove that liberal democracies are the better answer to the global challenges we are facing in the coming decades. So thank you very much. And I hope we will keep in touch and we will have opportunities to continue this kind of global conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.